Welcome to This Explainer. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of platforms, pipelines, and production systems, we need to zoom out and look at the big picture. Because offshore oil and gas doesn't exist in a vacuum. Today, we're taking a fascinating macro to micro journey through the incredible scale of the offshore energy industry. We're going to zoom all the way out to planetary energy consumption, and then travel all the way down to the nuts and bolts economics of a single offshore platform. Let's jump right in. So let's start with a number that puts literally everything into perspective. 100 million. The world consumes exactly 100 million barrels of oil every single day. That's not a typo, folks. 100 million barrels day after day, year after year. It's the global engine powering our cars, planes, and ships. It's heating our homes, making our fertilizers, and creating the plastics for thousands of products we take for granted. It's just a staggering figure, and it is the absolute foundation of why this industry even exists. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at the global energy engine. Then, the offshore frontier. Next up, the shrinking elephants. After that, who's who in oil. And finally, the billion-dollar math. All right, Section 1. The global energy engine. We know the world burns through 100 million barrels daily, but where exactly is all this massive demand sourced from? Well, Saudi Arabia sits comfortably at the absolute peak with roughly 265 billion barrels of proven reserves. To put that into perspective, that's about 17% of the entire world's known oil supply, resting in just one single country. You've also got countries like Venezuela and Canada holding massive reserves. On the flip side, when we look at natural gas, the Russian Federation takes the lead, holding around 20% of the world's total. But here's the really crucial takeaway for us today. A massive and rapidly growing share of this global production is no longer coming from land. Which brings us to part 2, the offshore frontier. See, the problem the industry faces is simple, but man, is it daunting. Onshore, the easy oil, it's largely mature and declining. The easy stuff has already been found, drilled, and produced. So, to keep feeding that daily 100 million barrel habit, the frontier is now underwater. We're talking the deepwater Gulf of Mexico, the giant fields of West Africa, off the coast of Brazil, and right here, in the incredibly dense and complex North Sea. Just look at this intricate web of fields and pipelines. It really highlights that these aren't just basic rigs out there. They're essentially fluting cities and massive processing plants. We're talking about some of the absolute largest and most expensive engineering projects in human history, operating in some of the harshest environments on the planet. Part 3. The shrinking elephants. Now, the nature of what we're actually finding beneath the seabed is changing. Here's something you might not know. The era of discovering massive, multi-billion barrel oil fields, what geologists lovingly refer to as elephants, is largely over. Let's just contrast the historic mega finds against today's discoveries to see how drastically the geology has shifted over time. Back in the 1950s, we were finding true elephants. The Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia, for instance, holds a mind-blowing 70 billion barrels. Today, well, finding a field with 500 million barrels, like the Buzzard field in the UK North Sea or the Mars field in the Gulf of Mexico, is considered a massive, highly respectable modern discovery. So the point here is that the giant leaps are mostly behind us. Today's game is all about maximizing these smaller targets. Let's break down the math on these smaller, modern fields to highlight why this matters so much. Today, many new discoveries are only between 20 and 70 million barrels. So let's say you have a 70 million barrel field, and it produces 20,000 barrels a day, which is actually a pretty modest rate for offshore production. That field, it's going to be completely depleted in under 10 years. And let me tell you, 10 years goes by in an absolute flash in offshore timelines. This highlights exactly why building a massive billion-dollar standalone platform for every single new discovery is becoming much, much harder to justify economically. Because those fields are shrinking, the industry had to adapt, and they came up with an incredible engineering solution: subsea satellite wells tying back to a central host facility. Think about it. Instead of building a brand new, astronomically expensive platform for a small 50 million barrel field, engineers install small wellheads directly on the seabed. Then they use flow lines to literally tie these satellite wells back to an existing host platform miles and miles away. We're essentially just plugging new, smaller reservoirs into infrastructure that has already been paid for. It's incredibly smart. But hold on, before you go spending hundreds of millions of dollars tying back a subsea well, you have to be absolutely sure the oil is actually down there. Enter the reserves pyramid. This defines some really critical industry jargon. When an operator says they have reserves, we break that down into 1P, 2P, and 3P. 1P means proven. These are resources that can be extracted with reasonable certainty under current economic conditions. 2P is probable, meaning there's about a 50% confidence level. And 3P is possible, which is highly speculative. Here's the golden rule. You don't build a pipeline on 3P. You build it on 1P.
Moving on to Section 4, Who's Who in Oil.
So, understanding those reserves dictates the money. And that requires a really complex corporate ecosystem to fund, manage, and build these massive offshore installations. First up, you have the state-owned national oil companies, or NOCs, like Saudi Aramco or Brazil's Petrobras. These guys control the actual mineral rights of their respective countries. Then you have the international oil companies, the IOCs. Think BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, Chevron, Total Energies. IOCs are totally capital rich and bring massive technological expertise. They often partner with NOCs through production sharing contracts or joint ventures. And finally, you have the service companies, brands like SLB, Halliburton, Baker Hughes, or Technip FMC. These companies provide the specialized offshore equipment, the diving support, the subsea construction. They are the actual boots on the deck, making all this engineering a reality.
And finally, Section 5, the billion-dollar RAF. So why on earth do we spend $500 million laying a single subsea pipeline? Well, because cost is always relative to revenue. Anchor your financial scale to this staggering number, $770 million. If you have a modest offshore field producing just 30,000 barrels a day, and let's say the oil price is at $70 a barrel, that single field generates $770 million in gross annual revenue. That is the incredible economic gravity of the offshore industry, right there. It completely justifies the mind-bending upfront costs of engineering deep beneath the ocean.
But let's break down that intense capital expenditure against the daily running costs, because this is where it gets wild. If you're building a fixed platform, your upfront CAPEX, your capital expenditure, is routinely going to run anywhere from $500 million to $1 billion just to get the structure built, towed out, and pinned to the seabed. But once that oil starts flowing, the spending definitely does not stop. The daily operational expenditure, or OPEX, to run that platform, paying the crew, doing maintenance, running safety systems, and power generation, that is an unrelenting $100,000 to $300,000 every single day. And this leads us to a fascinating and honestly pretty counterintuitive financial reality. Over a typical 25-year lifespan of an offshore installation, the operating costs often double or even triple the build costs. That $1 billion build cost for your CAPEX, it is completely dwarfed by the $2 to $3 billion it's going to cost to actually run the thing for a quarter of a century. Operating offshore is not just a triumph of structural engineering, it is an absolute marathon of financial and operational endurance. Which leaves us with a critical question to end on. We know the easy oil is gone, we know the fields are shrinking, pushing us to clever solutions like subsea tiebacks. And we've seen the relentless daily costs of operating in this harsh environment. So, with smaller fields and notoriously volatile global prices, what exactly is the next frontier for offshore engineering? Will it be fully autonomous seabed factories or something else entirely? I invite you to ponder that next major technological leap. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those great questions, and I'll catch you next time.